Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Nick Martin. I'm a public member on the EQB for Congressional District 4, and also chairing this subcommittee for pilot project implementation. Wanted to sort of call the meeting to order and thank everyone for joining, both SPPI subcommittee members and members of the public. I think we're just going to start with quick introductions of the rest of the subcommittee. Let's see, could we start with, I think that Commissioner Arnold is not on, but Louise Miltich is on her behalf. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. I am Louise Miltich. I am standing in for Grace Arnold. I'm with the Minnesota Department of Commerce, and I work in our Energy Environmental Review and Analysis unit. So we do the environmental review.
Great, thank you, Louise. Member Konar-Steenberg, how about you?
Sure. Mehmet Konar-Steenberg, public member, District 5.
Great. Member Forsberg, I think you're on.
Yes, Al Forsberg, public member, Congressional District 1.
Thank you. And Member Yawaki, do we have you? See that Ben unmuted, but I don't hear you, Ben. I think we do have Ben Yawaki, who's a public member from Katie, what district? I don't recall the number.
And I have to recall off the top of my head, which I'm not remembering either. So we will try to get Ben connected here the best we can.
Great.
Ben, could you try unmuting one more time to see if we can, oh, we can hear you now. Great.
Hey, okay. I'm glad we got that figured out. Ben Yawaki calling in, audio working this time. Representative of a citizen member of the 3rd Congressional District. Excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Member Yawaki. We can hear you just fine now. Okay, I think that I think my next item is just to sort of very briefly sort of frame up the goals of this meeting, and then I'm going to hand off to Katie to talk about the logistics. So as you recall from it was just a week ago, we had our first meeting, and most of the focus of that meeting was really on the design of the pilot program. You know, what was the structure going to look like? How are you going to involve people? How to create a kind of a productive working environment for project proposers and RGU representatives, and as well as, you know, sort of get input from a broad variety of stakeholders. So today, I feel like the general sense from that meeting was the pilot program design makes a lot of sense, but we kind of deferred until today what I think is going to be a really, you know, get into the really interesting part of the discussion. And I'll just read this one sentence. The goal of the pilot program is to assess the efficiency and effectiveness of climate information included on the draft revised Environmental Assessment Worksheet form. And so there's a couple things in that, efficiency and effectiveness. And I think we're going to talk some today about what those words mean in this context and how we can think about metrics to measure those objectives. And our focus will be on the EAW form, of course, not on the climate information in the EAW form. And then we'll also talk some about metrics for effectiveness of kind of the pilot program overall, as opposed to the effectiveness and efficiency of the form. So we will hear from Denise Wilson some thoughts on preliminary thoughts on metrics, and then hopefully have a good discussion with the subcommittee members and the public around whether those are the right definitions and whether those are the right metrics for the pilot program to pursue. After which point, you know, there will be another meeting with the ERIS committee in January, and then the pilot program will be implemented over the next you know, months after that, really following the design and the metrics that we talk about today. So I think today is an important conversation to make sure that we're sort of getting things off on the right foot. So that's my thoughts about our goal today. I think unless there's anything that other subcommittee members want to add to that, I will have Director Pratt sort of, or maybe I should go to you right away, Director Pratt, to just sort of talk through the logistics so people know how to participate in this meeting.
Sure. Thanks, Chair Martin. That was a great introduction. I'm Katie Pratt, Executive Director of the Environmental Quality Board, and thanks everyone for being here today. I'm just going to talk you through the logistics. This meeting is going to be very similar to the way we ran things at our last subcommittee meeting a week and a half ago. And really the goal of this meeting is to feel a bit like a workshop and to work through and discuss some of the issues. The goal of by the end of the meeting is not that we have every last detail figured out. We won't get there in the space of the 2 hours that we have, but hopefully to bring out the important questions and discussion, and then staff will take what you all gave us and the feedback and work through that more before bringing it to ARIS in January. So we hope that it's a great discussion today. So the way that the agenda will flow is, in a minute, I'll hand it over to Denise Wilson with EQB, and she'll present to you all some slides about how we do think about efficiency and effectiveness, and propose some draft metrics for your consideration. SPPI members, you'll have some time to discuss after that presentation and ask some clarifying questions of Denise. And then when there's sort of a pause in the conversation, we will open it up for public comment and bring the public into the conversation. So if you can just bring the next slide forward. Oh, I do want to remind you before I get into that. So just making a plug for this, for those of you who are maybe joining this meeting and haven't heard this plug before, we do have 4 public member board positions open from congressional districts 1, 2, 7, and 8. If you're interested in these at all, we encourage you to look at, there's additional information on our website, or you can reach out to me if you have questions. Happy to chat with you about these positions, and we're trying to really get the recruitment out there. So please help us spread the word as well. Okay, next slide, please. Great, so just the kind of procedures for public comment. If you wish to give public comment, you can use the raise your hand feature in WebEx, and I'll show you that in a minute. Or if that's not working for you, you can always type your name into the chat and we can find you that way. When it is time for public comment, we'll ask that you introduce yourself so folks know who you are, and then trying to keep your comments concise and making sure there's time for everybody who wishes to speak today. Next slide, please. Great, so just where you find that raise your hand feature, if you're not familiar at WebEx, is what you're going to do if you're joining from your computer is navigate to the list of participants and find your name, and then there's a little raise hand button right next to your name. If you're joining by your phone, you'll have to go first to 3 dots that are at the bottom of your screen, and that'll get you to the raise hand feature. And if you have any questions in our board packet, or use the chat, and we can connect with you for any technical assistance. Next slide, please. Great. So after we hear from the public, there'll be time, board members, for additional discussion and conversation based on what you heard from the public, and digging in deeper to the topic of conversation today. So that's what I have in terms of logistics. Chair Martin, I'll turn it back to you to introduce our speaker.
Great, thank you. So as last week, our primary speaker today, Denise Wilson, Director of the Environmental Review Program at EQB. Denise is going to walk us through, as I said, some understanding of those terms and some draft metrics. So Denise, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Martin and members of the subcommittee. This afternoon, I'm going to talk about the draft pilot program metrics for effectiveness and efficiency. Next slide, please. But before I begin discussing the draft metrics, I wanted to share some highlights from the discussion during the November 30th subcommittee meetings. What we heard from the discussion was that as we think about the design and implementation of the pilot program, we should be sure to include strategies to recruit greater Minnesota participation. We should be sure to include opportunities for small responsible governmental units, RGUs, who actually prepare the environmental documents, and who are not participating in the pilot program to weigh in. We should include opportunities for transparency and public engagement throughout the pilot program. And also that we should be sure to include a focus on metrics specifically on the climate information. Next slide, please.
Yes, Chair Martin. As we go through these slides, Mr. Al Forsberg, got some comments on that last page, the last slide page, that it might be, I guess I would like to make those comments while we're on that page rather than after we've gone through all the pages.
That's okay with me. Does that work for you, Denise, to take some comments as we go?
Oh, absolutely, sure.
Sure.
All right.
Go ahead.
One of the things we discussed, and something I feel is quite important, is that the project proposers be involved in this pilot project also, since they're the ones that do these documents, as well as the RGU reviewing those documents. So we've had testimony from the Minnesota Chamber of Commerce, the ag industry. I think there's been some interest from residential developer folks. I think it's important that the people that actually do these documents have a voice and have an opportunity to be involved. It may take some special innovation to do that, just as with the rural RGUs, but that's something I'd like to see added to this page.
Thank you, Subcommittee Member Forsberg. We share that sentiment. In fact, earlier today, we actually met with representatives of the Chamber of Commerce and asked them that specific question. You know, what is the best way to keep them engaged, and who do they feel are important, you know, people to make sure that we reach out to and get their feedback. And so I will add that to the list, and going forward, we'll definitely be sure to consider that.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Mr. Chair, can I make a comment?
Sure, go ahead.
I appreciate that suggestion, and appreciate the fact that, as Ms. Wilson indicated, sounds like staff will be reaching out to those various constituencies to get that input. There are obviously a number of constituencies that are interested in this project, and I understood the bullet point, maybe the third bullet point on your previous slide, with respect to public participation. I sort of read that bullet point as speaking to all of those constituencies, that we want to welcome everybody into this conversation as much as possible to make sure that this is the best informed process going forward. I do think of that as different than what I think is a necessary focus on this being a pilot project for RGUs. I don't think of this, in my mind, as a pilot project for a bunch of different constituencies and communities. I think this is a pilot project that is really where the RGUs really have a special role. And I do think it is important to have a broad mix of RGUs participating, both from the metro and from greater Minnesota. That only makes this a better process. But I do start to get a little bit concerned when we start to say that certain people or certain groups or organizations deserve a special seat at the table. And I don't necessarily understand that would be the suggestion here, but that is something I'm sensitive to. I want to keep the focus on this being a pilot project. And the folks who are at the forefront of that pilot project are the RGUs, in my estimation. Thank you for allowing me to comment.
Yeah, I guess I disagree in that the people that have to produce these EAWs aren't just another member of the audience. They're the ones that have to produce the document, provide the information. They're key, along with the RGUs, in whether this works or not.
Mr. Chair, if I might respond.
Yeah, go ahead. I want to flag, we will have more time for discussion after Denise presents. And so I think it makes sense to talk about this now, because right now Denise has talked about what we talked about last week, and she's going to get into metrics. So we can let this go a little bit, but let's just keep in mind there'll be more time to talk about this. I do think, well, go ahead, Member Koner-Steenberg, with your response.
I'll keep it very, I acknowledge that, and I'll keep it very brief. I would just say that by rule, one of the important constituents here is the public. One of the main purposes of environmental review is to generate information for the public. And so that's why I construe this as really an opportunity, and the importance of making sure the public has a role here without sort of narrowly defining what that means to mean certain classes have better access than others. But I'm happy to defer that conversation to later, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Mr. Chair, I might just jump in with a point of clarification, and then I think we can move on. I think one thing in this third bullet point where we say public engagement, what we are meaning by that, and we could maybe adjust our terminology to be more clear, is people who will be impacted by these changes. And so that includes project proposers, that includes members of the public, and they won't all be impacted the same way, but they will experience impact. And so we want to make sure that people who will be impacted by these changes have a chance to weigh in and bring their voice to the process.
Great, thank you. So I'm happy to come back to this issue after Denise's presentation too, but let's let her go ahead with the metrics, and then if we want to talk more about this, we certainly can.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Next slide, please. So, just as a reminder, the purpose of the pilot program is to assess the effectiveness of the proposed climate information on the draft revised environmental assessment worksheet form, as well as to assess the efficiency for providing the information. The metrics we are going to discuss ensure informed decision-making and trust in the pilot program process. Next slide, please. I think this slide really helps get the clarification around sort of the purpose of the information. And we've often talked about the producers of the information. So to your point, Subcommittee Member Forsberg, the project proposers and the RGUs work together to produce the information, but then to your point, Subcommittee Member Conor Steedberg, that the purpose is also the consumers of the information. And so to frame the discussion on the metrics, I think it's helpful to consider that one of the primary objectives of the environmental review process is to provide usable information to the project proposer, government decision makers, and the public concerning the primary environmental effects of a proposed project. Each of these different groups may define usable information a little differently. Next slide, please. Some examples of usable climate information considered by the technical team when they developed the draft revised environmental assessment worksheet form included the ability for project proposers to use the information for project design and mitigation decisions, the ability for government decision makers to understand potential climate effects of an individual project relative to climate effects of other existing and proposed projects, as well as how the additional impacts from this project will affect the ability to meet longer state and local greenhouse gas reduction goals, and the ability for the members of the public to understand the potential climate effects of a proposed project before approval decisions, so that they may meaningfully provide input during the public process for those approvals. Next slide, please. Once the metrics are approved, we will recommend the best tool for collecting the information. Depending on the sources, we may use surveys or interviews, and for some feedback, we may need to consider convening focus groups. As we collect the information, we will compile and summarize the results by theme and provide those summaries for subcommittee members, board members, and members of the public. Finally, we will return to the board with final recommendation that consider the metrics and the information collected in December of 2022. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to walk through 3 possible metrics for effectiveness of the climate information included on the draft revised EAW form, 3 possible metrics to assess the efficiency for providing the climate information, and 3 metrics to assess the pilot program design. I will also talk briefly about the possible sources of the information that we would connect with to collect that information. Next slide, please. Climate information was considered in, okay, so these are the draft, this is the first metric for effectiveness. And It considers that climate information was considered in project design and provided on the draft EAW form, that projects quantify and assess the greenhouse gas emissions, and that responses provided for adaptation and the responses were provided for adaptation and resiliency planning. EQB plans to reach out to project proposers and RGUs and also spend time reviewing completed EAWs that use the revised draft EAW form. Next slide, please. The second metric for effectiveness is to look at the new climate information to measure the new climate information helps project proposers, the public, and RGUs understand potential climate effects. EQB will reach out to project proposers and members of the public and RGUs. And then also the third metric is that RGUs are able to assess climate impacts accurately and consistently. And to get that information, we plan to reach out to RGUs and then also look at any feedback that's collected during the collaborative forums. Next slide, please. So one of the metrics, the first metric for efficiency, is that the new climate questions on the EAW form are clear and unambiguous. EQB will reach out to project proposers, REGUs, and members of the public to better understand whether or not that is that was factual, that was their experience, and that the additional time and cost for providing climate information actually results in usable climate information. And again, depending on the lens of the person looking at the information, that usability may change. And so we want to tap into making sure that on all three accounts, the project proposers, the RGUs, and members of the public feel that that information was helpful and usable. Next slide, please. So the third metric for efficiency is that the tools provided in guidance, both section 1 for the carbon footprint and section 2 of the adaptation resiliency guidance, that they're user-friendly, easily understood and applied, that they are able to provide consistent and accurate information, and that they provide information relative to a specific project location. And we'll reach out to EQB staff, will reach out to project proposers and RGUs that use the form, and also again, collect some of that feedback during the collaborative forums. Next slide, please. So we actually, after some thought about the metrics for efficiency and effectiveness, also felt that more discussion might be needed to make sure that, you know, to the point that once the pilot program is over, that we're able to capture information and reflect, and that the design effectively accomplished what we intended by implementing this pilot program. And so one draft metric would be that the pilot program included a cross-section of RGUs from state agencies and local governments in Metro and Greater Minnesota. And we'll be able to gather that information from pilot program registration information, and that the pilot program provided meaningful mechanisms to engage Greater Minnesota RGUs who have few staff and are not currently evaluating EAW. And we're planning to do very thoughtful, once we take the information from the last meeting and this meeting, to use that information to really help us lean into that pilot program and engagement design and implementation. And that's information. How we plan to do this will come back in January when we present sort of the entire framework for the pilot program for the Environmental Review Implementation Subcommittee. So next slide, please. And here's the third metric for pilot program design, that the pilot program provided meaningful mechanisms for input and transparency for all interested environmental review program participants. And this data will be collected from the pilot program engagement design. Next slide, please. Just as a reminder, here's the timeline for the pilot program. Right now, October and November, we're beginning our recruitment. Again, the pilot program is focusing on the responsible governmental units and the consultants, because those are primarily the folks that are going to actually be developing information that goes into the form and providing that information. And we want to make sure that they have as much support as we can to ensure accurate and helpful information. We're going to be designing the implementation elements and then affirming the effectiveness and efficiency metrics. From January through September, and actually that should be January 2022, we're going to be supporting participation in the recruitment of pilot program participants and also collecting information. We're going to be providing regular updates during board meetings and environmental review implementation subcommittee meetings. And then in September and November, we're going to be compiling the information and sharing that information. And then again, bringing back a final EAW form to the board in December of 2022. Next slide, please. Actually, we can hold it here. But before we begin the public input portion, Mr. Chair, are there any questions that I can answer?
So thank you, Director Wilson. We're significantly ahead of schedule, so we've got some time now. In our planned agenda, this time was sort of for clarifying questions from the subcommittee members, and then we would go to public comment, and then we would have a significant amount of time after that, again, for subcommittee member discussions informed both by what you might be thinking about now as well as the public comment. So we can, we've got some time. If you want to sort of chime in now, initially with clarifying questions, that would be useful. But if we slide a little bit into discussion, that's fine. But just keep in mind that we will have more input from the public and then a chance to talk more after that. Let me start with you, Member Connor Steenberg.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I had a question about what I think is efficiency metric 2, which is, and I've got my PDF of this PowerPoint deck. Additional time and cost for providing climate information results in usable climate information. And the question was with respect to assessing that additional time and cost, to what extent will questions that are posed or data gathered about time and cost take into account the fact that most of this is being done maybe for the first time, and that I would anticipate that as folks get used to this process and used to a system and used to the kinds of questions and data being sought, the time required to answer these questions and the cost of answering those questions really ought to go down over time. I mean, is that built into the assumptions here?
So, Mr. Chair, subcommittee member Connor Steenberg, that's an excellent question, and it's something we grappled with because time and cost has been consistently brought forward, and it's hard to understand as part of the draft recommendations, the draft report on recommendations. We actually had a consultant go through the process and give us a framework for the time and cost. But the challenge with that is equating that to the value of the information. So you're right, as people go forward, they'll become more efficient and the cost will go down. So rather than actually coming up with a number for time and cost, the goal here for this metric would just make sure that there was value, affirmed value for whatever the time and cost, for producing that information. And that each of, that the project proposer felt like it was a worthy investment, that the RGUs felt that they were able to efficiently, obtain the information and provide information, and that members of the public felt that it provided that usable information. So I think that was the focus or our thinking on that metric. But again, these are just draft metrics at this point, and we welcome any kind of clarification or additional elements that you think might help inform a board decision on that topic.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Could I add, just to piggybacking on that same question? So Director Wilson, are you saying there would be quantitative information collected though? Is that correct, on kind of hours spent and costs? It wouldn't just be a qualitative sense of asking the participants, did they think that the amount of time and cost was reasonable relative to usable information? Would the pilot program still be asking them to collect, how many hours did you spend?
Chair Martin, that's an option. Yes, I think once we have the metrics and refined enough, then we would sort of develop the mechanism for collecting that information. But if that is information you feel is important to the board, then we could definitely add that to the list of information that we would collect and compile and then provide for consideration when you're considering this measure.
Okay, well, we can talk more about that. I acknowledge Member Conner-Steenberg's point that it might be more at first, plus they're taking time participating in a pilot project in addition to doing this stuff, right? But
Right.
But I am interested just in the general question of, where can we get, I always like quantitative data for, for a pilot program, including for a pilot program. So where can we get quantitative and not just sort of anecdotal or qualitative? Maybe that's something we can kind of keep in mind in the later discussions. Member Forsberg.
Yes, a couple things. One on these costs and time. I assume that would include the additional cost and time for the project proposer to develop the information, and then the additional time and cost for the RGU to evaluate it and consider it, because those are both real public costs in the end. The other point I had was, as this information comes in, will it be presented to the pilot subcommittee? Does a pilot subcommittee have an additional role beyond setting these metrics?
Mr. Chair, Subcommittee Member Forsberg, I guess that's up to the subcommittee. My caution, excuse me, my caution would be that as we gather information, that it may change over time. And so presenting, short summaries of that information early might actually not be necessarily as informative as the full set of information that we collect. But we're, we can do whatever the subcommittee and board feel is important.
Yeah, I think that's worth talking some more about because, maybe some agreed progress reports would make sense so that, if we hear about it at the end, we can't give any feedback that would change the design from that for the remainder of the project. So we can think more maybe about, obviously the project needs some time to proceed before there's anything to report, but did you have more, Member Forsberg?
Yeah, that's my concern, Nick, is that we wouldn't see this data until it's presented to the ERIS or to the full board, and then it would have information and would have gone in a different direction that we were completely unaware of. We may want to change the program, make some revisions to it, at least better understand it as the information comes in.
Mr. Chair,
Yes.
I'm inclined to agree with Member Forsberg and with the chair that some system for periodic updates makes a lot of sense. I think it's also consistent with one of the other metrics, which is this notion of transparency. I mean, that particular metric has a particular focus, but I think that broader theme of keeping this process as transparent as possible, I think that can only, that makes a lot of sense to me. So I agree with those comments.
Thank you. And
my other question, okay, and I shouldn't mix my questions, I guess, but was on the time and cost, including both the RGUs and the project proposers.
So, Subcommittee Member Forsberg, if again, we can collect and we can ask for any information that you think is important.
I'm thinking that some of the RGUs, especially the rural ones, would be hiring consultants that might have a pretty significant cost to work with them.
Mr. Chair, I think it would be helpful for us too, as you deliberate this sort of topic, the time and the cost and the value, that you kind of help us better understand how you might use that information, how it might inform your decision making, so that we make sure that we collect not just a number, but sort of the intent. We follow the intent of that number, and we can collect any other additional information that might be helpful to understand that number in context.
Great. So I've been trying to take notes, and I'm going to try to flag some things for us to come back to after the public comment on some of these things that I think are worth more discussion. I just wanted to see if either Ms. Miltich or Member Iwaki, do you have any kind of brief comments or clarifying questions before we do that?
Mr. Chair, I do actually have, I think I'm headed in more of like the logistical direction. So I've got a few clarifying questions around that type of stuff. So when we talk about like we are collecting this information, Denise, who is it that you are anticipating will collect the information? Maybe it's a two-pronged approach with, you know, the RGUs and you're compiling it. I don't know. I'm just curious about the logistics of how that comes together.
So thank you, Mr. Chair, Subcommittee Member Miltich. That's a good question. At this point, we came up with a framework for the metrics. We identified sort of the sources or the metric itself, and then sources where we could get that information. And depending on how that metric is finally framed, I think that will inform the actual tools that we use to capture that information. Like I mentioned earlier, it could be a survey, it could be a focus group, it could be, you know, one-on-one interviews. But we do envision that EQB staff will be the ones that develop that mechanism, collect it, compile it, and theme it.
Okay, that's helpful. Mr. Chair, if I may proceed with a couple more follow-on questions. I'm curious then, coming out of this meeting and the discussion here, once we've settled on metrics, will there be some formal way to communicate to the RGUs that are already enrolled in the pilot? These are the metrics we've decided on, and we need you to start collecting this information now. And the reason I ask that is because I know, at least in my unit, we've got some projects already that are moving forward using the draft EAW form and collecting information like the number of hours that it's taking to address some of these different issues. The sooner the pilot program participants know that they need to be collecting that information, and the more kind of concrete we can be about it, I think the better our information collection will be.
That's an excellent point, Chair Martin and Subcommittee Member Miltich. The plan now is to, again, go back and consider all the discussion from the last meeting and this meeting, and then create that framework, and then bring it to the Environmental Review Implementation Subcommittee meeting in January. I believe it is January 19th is the subcommittee meeting. The first week of January, the board packet will go out, and that will have sort of the final proposed metrics, and it will include more specificity about how we intend to collect that data, who we intend to get it from. And then, but going forward, I would look to the subcommittee to make sure that that's where the metric, that framework actually is aligning with their intended purpose and needs. And then going forward from that date, I think there would be very clear. We could work with any projects that are currently underway to try to go back and, you know, retroactively capture that information too.
Mr. Chair, I have just one more question, if I may.
Please go ahead.
I'm always kind of thinking about, okay, what existing frameworks do we have for gathering information about how well we're doing in our environmental review? And a big component of that is the feedback that we get on our environmental review documents. So comments on the environmental review document. And even at the beginning of the process when we're doing, I guess for an EAW, you don't have scoping, so that's a separate thing. Let's just talk about the comments at the end. What is how do you see those comments, the regular public comments, feedback that we get on our environmental review documents, how do you see that information feeding into these metrics? Like where does that plug in?
So
And the reason I ask is I think that there are people who are tuned into our process on a regular basis that aren't necessarily interested in engaging in this effort separately, but they do have these things on their minds.
that's an excellent point. And Mr. Chair, Subcommittee Member Miltich, you know, again, thinking through once we have the framework for the metrics, it'll be a little bit easier to sort of brainstorm and be creative about how we capture that information. But I think that is a really key group of people. So the real consumers of that information to tap into. And you know, one way we might do that is to develop a survey that RGU could send out, or that we have available like after the experience, that captures some of that information from members of the public, especially those that took their time to comment on a specific project. But the challenge will be if you know, the comment on the project sort of influences the comment on the process. So we'll have to be very careful in how we tease that apart.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks, Director Wilson. I appreciate the answers, and I'm satisfied with my clarification questions. So I'll hand it over to Committee Member Iwaki.
Thank you. Those are great questions. Member Iwaki, anything from you right away, or certainly more time later? Okay, and Member Forsberg still has his hand up, but that might be left over. Alan, do you have anything?
There's,
Yeah.
I had a question on one of the metrics, efficiency metric 3. Do they provide information relative to a specific project location? And climate change is a global problem, not a specific local problem. So I guess I'm wondering why the emphasis on the specific project location?
Well, Mr. Chair, Subcommittee Member Forsberg, I think that metric was really trying to capture, you know, the relevance of the resiliency and adaptation planning. That when they use the tools to consider, you know, those implications, that it really gives them enough specific data at a granular level that they can actually make some project decisions. And with ease. Again, it's a metric for the I think this is the pilot program design, and I think you were asking for the efficiency metric number 3, right? And that's really geared towards the tools, the efficiency of how the tools performed. There we go.
So would an example be the hydrology of a residential development and having a current discharge information for that particular location?
That's correct.
All right, thank you.
Great. Any other clarifying questions? All right, so I think we're going to transition over to public comment now. Director Pratt, I forget who is facilitating this, but maybe we can go to that, see if any members of the public want to comment now.
And I just would remind members of the public who are joining us to either use the raise hand feature or to chat to make sure we can see you that you want to give public comment. And let's see. Okay. Katrina, can you queue us up for any commenters? Thank you.
Yes, we currently have one member of the public who would like to speak. Amelia, you should be unmuted now.
Hear me?
Yes, we
Great. Okay, I'm seeing nods. Hi, this is Amelia Voss from Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And just a few initial thoughts. My first thought is about quantitative metrics in this, gathering quantitative metrics in this type of proposal. And I just want to note kind of a big caution that when I think about quantitative metrics, those really need to be collected in a way that kind of complies with some kind of scientific method for them to be useful. And I'm not sure that the information that we can glean from this pilot will fall into that category. So for example, we're going to have a myriad of project types that fall within the pilot, and none of us have any idea at this point what they're going to be. You know, it could be a residential development, it could be a commercial use building, it could be a new event venue, it could be a feedlot, it could be a million different things. And so if we collect quantitative data about the time and cost that it takes to do this analysis for those projects, it's going to be hard to do any kind of apples to apples comparisons because, you know, the time that it takes and cost that it takes to do this kind of analysis for one type of project is going to vary from another type of project, is going to vary from one consultant to another consultant. And so there's my caution is that there's a lot of variables at play here, in addition to what member Konar Steenberg was mentioning about, you know, also having some cost additions and that this being early days and this being the first time that we're doing some of these analyses. You know, and if we're really understanding what the additional cost of this new analysis is, you know, then we have to go back and compare it to a similar project with a similar consultant before this type of analysis was added. So I think that gathering quantitative metrics sounds attractive, but is really rife with complexities and problems in this particular pilot. So I would echo a large caution against that, just because I don't think that that's going to be very usable and defensible information. My second comment is on the effectiveness metrics, and as I'm looking through those three metrics, I see that only one of those metrics, which I believe is effectiveness metric 2, involves some feedback from the public. And my caution on that is if your effectiveness metrics create sort of if 2/3 of the metrics are consulting only 2/3 of the environmental review triad, which I'm talking about, you know, the people who participate in environmental review being the project proposers, the RGUs, and the public. That's the triad that I'm referencing. If only one of your effectiveness metrics consults the public, then I think you're going to have potentially skewed data because you're getting, you know, more response and more feedback from 2/3 of this triad, and the public is, in my opinion, just as is of equal importance as those other two prongs. So my suggestion is that the metrics in effectiveness be framed in a way where where all three of those participants have a voice in the response. And particularly if we could look at effectiveness metric 1, I don't mean to be bossy, but if it's possible to pull it up, I think that'd be really helpful. When I look at this metric, this is one that I would certainly want to weigh in on as a member of the public, because I can see, you know, right away my opinion of whether the responses provided for adaptation and resiliency planning or quantified and assessed greenhouse gas emissions. I might have a different opinion as a member of the public about whether an EAW form did that versus an RGU or a project proposer. I can think of numerous instances in engaging in environmental review where the project proposer and the RGU felt like a question on the EAW form was sufficiently answered and the public did not. And so I think especially effectiveness metric 1 would be a place where it would be really critical to get the public's feedback about whether they felt like that information was truly provided on the form or not. And that's my feedback. Thank you so much.
Just noting on a logistical front, we're trying to get that slide up, but having a little difficulty here.
All right, thank you, Ms. Voss. Any others queued up as yet?
We currently do not have any other members of the public who would like to speak at this point, Chair Martin.
Okay. I'll read just a couple sort of thought-provoking questions in case this is helpful, or just to stall a little bit to give others time to raise your hand if you'd like. One of the things we really wanted people to think about is, are there other metrics we should consider for the either effectiveness or effectiveness of the climate information or efficiency obtaining it, or of course the effectiveness of the what Denise called the design. And are there missing elements or ideas that you think might improve what information should be used to determine if this climate information currently included on the EAW should stay the same, or are there climate questions that should be added or deleted? So Ms. Voss talked about a couple of those things already. Just wanted to sort of plant those seeds in case those motivate thoughts from anyone else.
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
So I guess thinking about that question and the comments that we just heard, and I'm looking at that effectiveness metric 1, and this may link up with some of the logistics discussions we just had. Now that I think about this, I guess the question that is what's not clear to me is who's making this assessment on metric 1, for example? Who is deciding whether the responses provided for adaptation and resiliency planning? Is it EQB staff that's making that assessment? Is that a question we are posing to project proposers or RGUs to answer themselves? I guess I'm unclear as I look at this again about who's providing the answer to, for example, effectiveness metric 1. So I'd be grateful for some clarification there. Thank you.
Oh, Mr. Chair, Subcommittee Member Conor Seberg, that the metrics itself is whether or not the climate information was considered in the project design and provided on the draft revised EAW form. So was it there? And then if it's there, was it considered? And so that would be a question that we would pose to project proposers and RGUs, and that we would look for, and this is EQB staff would look for, we would collect this information and provide that back to the board and say, that it was there, and then the response from project proposers and RGUs, if we did a survey or if we followed up on one-on-one interviews to ask them this question, and then we would compile that information. And so out of that, I guess it would depend on the types of questions that we asked to measure this metric. So that would be helpful to know what information around this question or this metric would be helpful that we should gather. And we'll flush that out in a little more detail too. If you feel like this is the right metric, and or if you feel like some wording changes might be made to get more of that qualitative or quantitative information, then we would develop the tool to gather that. But ultimately it would be the subcommittee members and the board members who would look at that information and make the decision on whether or not, based on that metric, we would consider that effective.
Mr. Chair.
Chair Martin.
Just a second, Member Forsberg, sorry. Member Conor Seberg, did you have a follow-up to that before?
I did, thank you.
Sorry,
I appreciate it. So if I understand that response, what we're saying is the metric was climate information considered in project design, and was it provided on the draft EAW form? And that's an assessment that EQB staff would be making. And did I get that second part correct?
We would gather the information to identify whether it was included and we would ask project proposers and RGUs whether or not they considered that information and maybe even how they considered it.
And so then what is the function of the bullet points that follow the metric?
Those are the elements, the changes to the EAW form that now we have, projects that quantify and assess greenhouse gas emissions, and they provided responses to adaptation resiliency planning. So one point with this metric would be, depending on the project type or the nature and location of the project, not all projects would respond to this question. And so we would have a sense of whether or not there was, essentially a completeness review, like which project types were most challenged to provide which information, which could inform whether or not the question should change or more guidance might be needed. And that we would get reflections from the folks who are providing that information and assessing the information to identify those challenges. And then I think to Ms. Voss's point, that we might add another bullet, a source of information, where we go back to members of the public and find out maybe how that they used that information too, right? Getting at the objective for usable information, so that we make sure that the value of every element of the EAW form and that information coming forward was usable.
Yeah, I'll go to you in a second, Member Forsberg. I just wanted to interject too. This metric was a little unclear to me as well, Director Wilson, because on the face of it, it seems like it's just saying, were the new questions answered? And it seems like if you're participating in this pilot and your RGU has said you need to answer these questions, like you don't leave the questions blank. So it doesn't tell us much to say, like, I mean, except for the point you just made that there might be some questions that are not relevant to specific project types, but I don't know, it's hard for me to imagine that any project type wouldn't have to, answer questions about carbon footprint and climate impacts. So as written, when I first read this, it was a little unclear to me the value of this, because it seems almost like, EQB assessing whether people answered the questions. Everybody's got to answer the new questions, I think. And but on the other hand, if there's, Ms. Voss implied there's sort of a judgment made about the quality or thoroughness or comprehensiveness of those answers, and there's really no kind of objective basis put out here for how, what makes a good answer. So I just feel like there's some further thought that might need to go into this metric to make it a little more specific.
Well, Mr. Chair, again, when we thought about these metrics, it was what information could we reasonably collect without, and being mindful of sort of the authorities that we delegate to other governmental units. And so I would be cautious to say, if we were doing a value statement on how those answers, were those answers sufficient based on a particular project, that would be overstepping the role of EQB to assess and to provide an assessment of each individual project. But the role of EQB is really looking at the program. And so it does get at whether or not people are answering the questions, because the question might be not applicable, or answer that no mitigation was planned. So that's an appropriate response to the prompt to provide information on mitigation. And that gets at the program aspect, and that information is valuable because, again, it informs the action that we should take based on the program effectiveness, and not necessarily the effectiveness of an RGU to evaluate a project.
Right. Okay. I realize we've diverged quite a bit from public comment at this point, but since I don't see anyone else queued up, let me go to Member Forsberg for your comment. But formally, we're still in the public comment period. So any other members of the public that want to raise your hand, please do. We'd love to hear from you.
Well, Mamet and Denise provided some good information and helped me think about this. But I guess my original question was, if the EQB staff evaluates all these EAWs on whether these climate change metrics were addressed or not, and if they were addressed well. I don't know if you have the staff to do that thoroughly. Then the balance is the whole process here assigns the EAW and the decision making to the RGU. If the EQB staff does that work, is it intruding on the RGU's authority?
So, Mr. Chair, Subcommittee Member Forsberg, we're not proposing that we evaluate the responses, but whether we review to determine if those elements were completed. And that it could be, yeah, that could be a good indicator, again, of whether or not people are struggling to respond to that, or whether there's more guidance that's needed based on sector specific needs. Or it's also an indicator that we can follow up with the project proposers and the RGUs to better understand why there was a barrier to that response.
The earlier public comment on if you provide quantified answers, they're difficult because of the different kinds of projects. But the purpose here was to provide guidelines, guidance, and sources on how to calculate and how to quantify these things. Just a thought. You know, is it more clear to have calculated, quantified calculations based on a guidance that's provided, or more clear to have subjective results?
Chair Martin, if I may just tag on to a few of the lines of conversation here, and I think there is just some more public comment to go, but first of all, you know, I do hear loud and clear that this effectiveness metric 1, I think, needs additional refining and clarity, and so that's something we can work on. Board member Forsberg, I mean, I think you do raise an interesting point that should go into our conversation about kind of the frequency of bringing information forward to the subcommittee for review, is that we don't want to sense in this process, as EQB is trying to collect data to inform the program, that we are somehow checking the work of the RGU. So we'll just, I think that's a nuance to keep in mind as we think about how we're collecting the data. And then, you know, to this last part about, you know, quantifiable and operative data, you know, I think there's good points raised all around, you know, and I think we can really work on some of the methodology. And, you know, I'm putting on my PhD social scientist hat here. There's no one approach that gets you all, you know, all the results in a perfect neat bundle that you need. It is an interpretive exercise, whether it's quantitative or qualitative. And the thing to do is to really examine what are the limitations of the data, what are the biases in the data, and to make sound conclusions to the best of the ability that you have based on the information that's there. So those are things we can look at very, very closely and very intentionally, and knowing there's no such thing as a perfect data set, right? And that's why we have many sets of eyes on it, including different EQB staff with different experiences, different knowledge of the program, and different board members who will also bring their interpretive lens to it, and to together get the best conclusion out of the data that we have in front of us. So I'll just pause there, but wanted to share those thoughts.
And Mr. Chair, I'll just add just a little bit to Katie summarized that very, very well. And the more I hear the conversation, it may be helpful to think of these metrics as sort of indicators rather than conclusions. That it's really up to the board to look at this information and draw conclusions from it. And so if these 3 key points or this data is collected that are indicators for you that the questions on the EAW form, the changes to the EAW form are effective and efficient, then that would inform how you would approve a form going forward. And I think that's our goal with setting it up the way that we did.
Martin, this is Katrina. We do have one member of the public who would like to add a comment. Amelia, you should be on.
Hi, it's Amelia Voss again with Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy. And I just piped up again because I might be able to add some anecdotal evidence that helps highlight why I think effectiveness metric 1 is actually pretty useful. So as a consumer of environmental review data, some of the things that I've seen in projects that have already attempted to do climate analysis in their EAW are one example is, you know, in answering a question about possible mitigations, I think Ms. Wilson identified this, but we've seen project proposers respond that they just didn't consider any mitigations. And so that's not really usable climate information for anyone, right? You know, I think a goal of this process is to have not to have, you know, specific outcomes, but to have projects at least think about, are there ways that we can design this project to reduce emissions that would also benefit our bottom line and help with our project being resilient to climate in the future. And so, so far, we've seen projects kind of avoid doing that inquiry, and I think that would be really helpful information for this subcommittee to have if project proposers are kind of avoiding that inquiry. What's the barrier? You know, or is that happening and why? And is there a way that we can rephrase the question or offer additional guidance to make that a easily doable question, which I think it really can be an easily answerable question. But I think this is helpful to identify that barrier. Another place where this has come up is in looking at how a project fits in with our Next Generation Energy Act goals. And so far, what I've seen on EAW documents is the response to that question being, you know, we're one project, climate change is a global problem, whatever we do can affect Next Generation Energy Act goals. And you know, I think that that's also not a useful analysis for anyone. I don't even think it's worthwhile to have an RGU type those words into a form. So, you know, if the question on the form is about compliance with Next Generation Energy Act isn't prompting an analysis that's useful, what's the barrier and how can we maybe offer more guidance or find a way to look at that that's a doable analysis. So I personally like effectiveness metric 1 because I am interested in seeing whether the questions get answered or not, and if not, you know, understanding a little bit what the barrier is and is there a way to make that analysis easier for project proposers and RGUs so we can all benefit from that information. So I hope that's helpful, that even though the questions are out there, sometimes they're answered with a non-answer, and I think we'd all like to avoid that. And the one other thing that came to mind that I'll just throw in is, as we're thinking about quantitative metrics, I think the other thing that I would encourage this group to think about is, what are the quantitative, if we looked at quantitative metrics, what do those tell us? Because I think that we can all say right now, you know, is there going to be some additional cost to do a climate analysis? I think probably. So is there, and it's going to be some time and effort to gather that data. So is it telling us something? And if so, what is it? Because, you know, this analysis is legally required. We have good Minnesota court decisions that say climate analysis is part of the environmental review purview and mandate. So, you know, cost isn't going to tell us, well, it's too expensive, we can't do it. So, you know, what does time and cost tell us? That's my other 2 cents about quantitative metrics. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks for those points. What you said, Ms. Voss, about projects finding out they can reduce emissions and help their bottom line and make their projects more resilient. I've been thinking about that a lot as well. And I think that, you know, it would be a useful outcome of this process if the tools and the requirement to answer these questions and the tools the state provides do help project proposers identify those kind of changes to their plan. That would be really concretely useful. So I do want to think about how the pilot program can capture that if it happens. And I also think you know, you made good points about the difficulty of quantitative metrics when all, you know, project types are so variable. But on the other hand, it seems to me if we don't collect quantitative data, we won't really have a way of documenting if the state has actually done a really good job of making this process not as time intensive and dollar intensive as we feared, because the state has provided good tools to do it. I want to capture that as a positive outcome too. And so those are some of the things I'm thinking about when we talk about, is the process providing usable information specifically for the project proposers actually, and are the tools that the state has provided making it you know, possible to answer these questions and use these tools in ways that maybe don't take as much time as we you know, fear. So I don't know if you have any response to that. I'll give you a short chance to respond before we go to Member Forsberg.
And Chair Martin, we don't have any more commenters. So members of the public, if you do wish to make a public comment, you know, do raise your hand. But at this time, Chair Martin, we don't see any others, so we can kind of branch into discussion.
Okay, we can shift into that. Let me start with you, Member Forsberg.
Yes, if I could be allowed to put on my highway engineer's cap, and I'm a project proposer for a highway safety project, and I need to do an EAW, I guess I would like to see guidance on specifically how to develop the greenhouse gas information. Because then you know what to do. You can ask a consultant to do it. If a project opponent, and there are always project opponents, is against it, they can go to what you did, compare it to what the EAW requirements are and the calculation method, and you've got something to go on. If it's subjective, you know, it's just wide open. You don't know what to do specifically, and how do you challenge someone who's saying it's not adequate? It's a very subjective thing.
And Chair Martin, we might be getting a little bit confused here about the data that is on the EAW form and whether that is quantitative or qualitative versus the data we're collecting during the pilot program being quantitative or qualitative. So just making sure that those are two different, you know, areas of consideration.
Yeah, that's a good distinction. I understood the point that Member Forsberg just made to be more relative to, I think, what's on the screen, you know, like, and whether it is there sufficiently objective guidance on what's a good response. The question of the quantitative question we keep coming back to was in one of the efficiency metrics relative to, you know, are we collecting time and cost information as a metric of efficiency? Other thoughts from any of the committee members?
And maybe I'll just jump in here too at this point, Chair Martin, just to clarify where we're at in the conversation. So Denise has presented the metrics. We've heard some really good thoughts and considerations from you all that I think us can go back and tweak some of these. So I think in some places it's getting maybe some tweaks and some clarity of the wording. I think also the next step that will help you and that we'll bring to ARIS in January is more of those details about how that information will be collected, so that, you know, you can collect or you can connect those dots and kind of picture what that information is going to be that will come in. And so what I think we want to do in the remaining time, and we have plenty of time, and we can end whenever seems like the right point, is just to get clarity from you all as subcommittee members. Are we on the right track? Are these the right, with some tweaks, is this kind of the right approach to the metrics? Or is there anything we need to more significantly change here? And then, anything else that we should be considering as we work up this next phase of design on the pilot program. I see a hand raised there, Chair Martin.
Sorry, I can't see. Oh, Ms. Miltich, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Martin. Sorry, the hand raising feature is like sometimes hard to keep track of when you're doing all the other things. In response to your question, Executive Director Pratt, as I look at these metrics, one thing that strikes me is there are times where we go out and study things and we gather information during environmental review, and it doesn't necessarily materialize in, say, a permit condition. And it's not a major point of discussion in say, the decisions that are made using that environmental review document. But there's still value in having studied it. You may study something and find, hey, this is not a big deal, right? But that doesn't mean there wasn't any value in studying it. You studied it and you found out, no big deal here. So I think the one thing that seems to, I'm not sure how to capture it, and I don't want to be not constructive, but I'm just throwing it out there that I don't see in these metrics a place where you would capture a value in doing this, even if it doesn't show up as, a permit condition or something. That just the value of studying something and finding out, okay, we don't need to worry about this on this project. There is something to that. I think of, like, for power lines, we study electric and magnetic fields, right? The conclusion most of the time is nothing to see here. That we're good on electric and magnetic fields, but it's the studying of it that leads us to that conclusion and puts to bed concerns and fears that people might have. And it's, I think, a valuable part of the assessment, even though it's not, in these metrics, I don't know where you would kind of identify that. So just a thought.
Yeah, and I'd like to respond to that, and I'd also like Denise Wilson to maybe chime in, because this is something we've been talking about a lot and trying to, think about how to best communicate that, because I do think practitioners of environmental review, that is something they frequently point out, and that is what our own kind of program staff oftentimes point out, is that doing the assessment may not always lead to, like you said, a permit condition, a change in project design, a particular outcome, but the assessment still has value because it maybe affirms a pathway that you're on, affirms that no further work is needed in that area, or or something else. And so it has intrinsic value of doing that assessment. And how do we evaluate that, or how do we kind of get at this in this process? Because I think where people always want to go is, well, it's not worth doing it, it's not important if it didn't lead to X, Y, and Z change. And I think there are ways we can maybe ask questions about that, or have conversations with practitioners during the cohort process. But we're also open to ideas of how we kind of ask questions around that. So I think that's a great nuance to bring up. And Denise, I don't know if you have anything to add on that point.
Executive Director Pratt, I do, and Mr. Chair, Subcommittee Member Miltich. And I think this is, we've had ongoing conversations about this, about the value. And I think the way we ended up with these metrics is that the focus was on usable information. And so we went back and looked at, I even looked up the definition of usable, and that's capable of being used, but it doesn't necessarily go to the point of, was it used? And there's also useful information. And that is that if you do use it, there's a benefit to it. And I think that's kind of the focus where we're looking at sort of the effectiveness and efficiency in how we gather this information, but also being mindful of the role of EQB. There's a lot of data we could collect, but it might not be helpful in the time that we have, in the way that we can statistically have that data be statistically valid. So we are left with a lot of qualitative assessments and values, even in how we apply the information to determine effectiveness. So this is challenging, I admit, but I think there is a path forward in keeping the focus on what is usable climate information, depending on the audience that uses that information. And that's where I say, if the time and the cost is really about the value, then if we have an effective and efficient process, that determines the value. That's all.
Yes, Chairman Martin.
Yes.
A couple of things. The question was, how do we feel about the metrics? And I think with our discussion today and some revisions, I think we're off to a good start with it. I guess I have a question. If staff is going to revise these metrics, will the subcommittee see those revised metrics before they go out?
Mr. Chair, Subcommittee Member Forsberg, I will, once they're drafted, before they go out, I will send it to subcommittee members.
Okay, thank you. And then another thought is, will there be a preface or an introduction that goes out with this information to the pilot projects? I'm thinking it would be helpful to provide a framework on why this is being done, a framework explaining that this is just getting at the emissions. Other important parts of greenhouse gases are reducing emissions, mitigating emissions, adapting to climate change, setting that overall framework so they see where this project fits and the UQB role fits within that framework. And then also, I think it would be interesting to ask the RGUs and the project proposers, this would put quite a burden in time and cost on both of them. Ask them if they have ideas for other ways to accomplish this awareness public education goal. Never hurts to get more ideas.
Yeah, thank you, Board Member Forsberg. So a couple of your points, I think Denise answered your question about, you will have opportunities to give further input as we're refining these. We definitely will pick your brains about that. In terms of that context for RGUs that are participating in the pilot program, absolutely. There's no intention that we would kind of just drop something in their laps without, context and, why are we doing this, what this is and isn't, making it clear, again, that the RGU still retains that role and discretion as an RGU. So, and that larger context piece, I mean, absolutely, we would give that. I think another nuance that I might gets beyond your question, Al, but another nuance I want to hear or want to add is just, another thing that we will balance in this process is both staff time for EQB staff and time for RGUs who are part of the pilot program. There might be, a 100 question survey that we would love to get all this information, but that's just not going to be feasible, right? So we are going to have to do some prioritizing of what information is going to be most helpful and what is kind of nice to know stuff that, we might just have to hold back on. In terms of the larger picture of like, what else should we be doing? I'm a little bit concerned about that creating more of a burden of information that we're gathering from this project and also maybe confusing the issue, right? We really want to stay focused and narrow on what this pilot program is. I think if we want that kind of feedback about other things the board should be working on, we can find different channels outside of the pilot program for those types of conversations. I just don't want to muddy the discussion here. And then, a final kind of global comment. I think just setting some expectations, and this is again kind of from my program evaluation and data science lens. You know, the reality here is that we're going to go through this process and hopefully get a bunch of wonderful information, but it's probably not going to be a silver bullet that says exactly. There's still going to be competing needs and different things that we're trying to balance in this process, right? So you as board members, hopefully this information will inform your decision, but there'll still be things to weigh, and there'll still be challenges and trade-offs that the board will need to consider based on the experiences in the pilot program. So, you know, we won't get all our questions answered magically through this process either. Those are my comments, Chair Martin, but, you know, anything else from subcommittee members, I'm happy to hear.
Member Connor Steenberg, I think you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. I just wanted to say, and should have said a long time ago, thank you to both Executive Director Pratt and Director Wilson for putting these points together and presenting them with such clarity. It's that clarity which allows people like me to snipe at these and present different kinds of critiques and wordsmithing kinds of things. But I really do appreciate the work that has gone into this, and I think it's moving things forward. And I'm grateful for what must be a tremendous amount of effort that went into putting all this together. So thank you for that.
Yes, I would echo his thank you, and also thank you for getting the slides out in advance so we could take a look at them and give them some thought.
Well, I just will have to add that you all keep us on our toes, and we know that you're going to ask us tough questions and count on you to do that. And that's what makes working for a board fun, is because you make our thinking better and stronger, and so do the members of the public who weigh in. You know, we get better end results and get to a better place because of these really, really great discussions. So, you know, glad to have a board that is so engaged and invested in this work.
Yeah, thank you so much. I wanted to see if, let's see, we've heard from everyone. Member Yawaki, your audio was in and out, but if we still have you, I just wanted to give you a chance to see if there's anything you wanted to flag for us as well. I still have some problems there.
It was working before, but board member Yawaki, we're not hearing you now, fortunately. We're going to try moving you back up again and seeing if your audio will. Try it one more time and we'll see if it works. Unfortunately, no.
Okay. I was sort of looking back over my notes and trying to think about flagging things that we touched on. This might be just flagging for EQB staff to think more about, or we might want to have more discussion. And I probably won't do this in a very organized way, but one of the issues certainly was time and cost in efficiency metric 2, and how quantitative can we get about that, right? Projects are all different. There's cost, there is bound to be cost and time. These are new questions. There's cost to the proposers, cost to the RGUs. We want to sort of capture that in some way. But also there's learning that happens that maybe reduces the cost over time. So that might just be, I don't know if we want to have more discussion on that, or we've kind of covered that. I just wanted to sort of flag it for the staff to think more about. I might have a couple of these, but I'll pause so that I don't try to introduce too much at once. Anything more on that topic?
Denise, did you want to chime in, or?
Oh, Mr. Chair, and as long as we have some time for discussion, I'll prompt this back to both members of the public and subcommittee members to help us think through how you might use that information, how that might inform your decision making. Because I can bring back, you know, this is the number of projects that went through, and then have RGUs and project proposers sort of self-report what that cost. I don't have a way of necessarily validating that number, but if you want to inform what moves forward in the EAW form, you know, how might you use it so that I make sure I bring back good information for you to make that decision?
Yes, the Chairman Martin. Bar Engineering did that study and it had a methodology. Can we just go by that?
Mr. Chair, I don't have the resources to hire externally, I don't believe, Katie, to do that kind of analysis on every project that goes through. But
So I think the question here is, can we bring back information to the board about time and cost? And yes, we can figure out a mechanism so that they're self-reporting on time and cost. And we hear that that's an important piece of data. And I think, you know, we can find a way to bring that forward. And I agree that's important. I think what Denise's question is then what do you do with that data? And you might not know yet. And I think that's okay. You know, is there a point at which you say it's too much or it's too little? How would you evaluate what is the right amount of time and cost? And I think there'd probably be a robust discussion around that and differences of opinion as well.
Well, one example, Director Pratt, could be like the time and cost data revealed that like the climate model tools in the guidance are okay. You know, they provide enough information to answer the questions. The RGUs and project proponents were able to answer those questions with a reasonable amount of time spent using the tools in the guidance. So that's a useful thing. I'm making this up, of course, but you know, the proponents really struggled with, you know, this aspect, or maybe specific project types really struggled to use the carbon footprint tools to come up with any answer. It took a lot of time. Therefore, the state ought to think about putting out more detailed tools for that project type, or, you know, something like that. I'm just, you know, sort of making this up, but that would be one way that kind of information I would think could be used.
Yeah, so that's really helpful. And I think that gets to a question that is about usability, right? And kind of gets to the efficiency metrics, which is, you know, if time and cost, you know, so what I hear you saying, if time and cost, there's a relationship there with clarity, and we might be able to get at, and there might be ways of asking, you know, did some part of this feel harder than, you know, harder than it needed to be? I don't know how we'd ask that, but, you know, where people feel like they don't have clarity and that it's not streamlined, and they're putting in more time and energy than they, you know, than they're, you know, think that they should need to for this question. And there might be ways that we can get at that, but, you know, we do hear loud and clear that let's make sure, you know, time and cost is part of the data that we're collecting and thinking about the best way to do it. I think, you know, with the nuance that's, you know, just a number floating in the air is not self-significant, right? We need more information around that number relative to, say, the complexity of doing it, relative to other factors, to be able to interpret that number sufficiently.
Sure.
Mr.
Did you have a? Oh,
yeah,
sorry.
That's really helpful, because now that sort of leads me to think that I don't need just a total project cost in time, but it might be helpful to get a little bit more granular, like which aspects of the form took the most time and, well, inferred relative cost, or was it more time but less cost? So you're really getting at the elements of the form that we've added, the changes that we've made, more so than just the overall doing everything. Is that what you're thinking?
I think that would be great, because it then would give the state a sense of like where to allocate a little more effort to make certain parts easier. But as you said that, I just realized that my suggestion would mean that, like, for example, Louise Miltich's staff has to do even more detailed tracking of which questions they're working on. You know, so that's maybe an added complexity there. But
And Chair Martin, there are a number of hands raised here.
yeah, let me go to you, Ms. Miltich. I think you raised your hand on this topic.
Thanks, Chair Martin. I did raise my hand on this topic just for a couple of things. I think when we get to talking about costs, I mean, Denise, you're asking what would be, you know, what end what would we do with that information? I think having information about costs, the relative nature of those costs is important. And maybe that makes the question to the RGU more complicated. But I think sometimes it's like, well, okay, this is a new element. We're going to focus in on how much does it cost to do this particular analysis. But that, as Ms. Pratt pointed out, is just a number floating in the air. It costs a certain amount to do the other components of an EAW too. I mean, you know, how much does it cost to do the wetland component, particularly if you send someone out and they're doing some kind of delineation. There may be projects for which that's a step that they feel they need to take at the point where they're doing an EAW. So I would caution against using the cost numbers of just the greenhouse gas component on their own as a measure of whether it's worth doing or not. Just want to throw that out there. The other thing I wanted to say, and we talked a little bit about this at the beginning, sort of how the costs are likely to reduce over time, maybe even over the time period of the pilot, as information is exchanged and we have, you know, hopefully different RGUs access to the same kinds of tools and we're learning from each other, and that I would hope would drive the costs down. So to some extent, the costs could be a measure of how well the pilot itself is working, right? Initially, we don't have a lot of tools at our fingertips, and you would hope that by the end of the pilot, we've consolidated our good learning and put tools in one place that different RGUs can use them. And so that was just another thought on cost. It might be a way to measure how well we're doing in terms of information exchange and making it easy for our sister agencies to do what they need to do. So just two thoughts.
Yeah, thank you. Mehmet, how about you?
Yeah, just very briefly, because my thoughts sort of got preempted there by the previous comments, but to the extent that we're going to add granularity to the question, I don't know if there's an effective way to do this, but simply to try to get at the idea of how much of the cost incurred here was what one might anticipate to be ramping up or first-time cost, educating oneself about this new process or the factors that go into it, and the kinds of costs we could expect to go down or disappear as time goes on, and this becomes something that folks replicate again and again. I'm not sure how to frame that question, as you can tell from the fact that I'm babbling here, but I think that is worth trying to get at, because I think we are going to have the first time around inevitably artificially inflated costs, or to put it differently, costs that don't truly represent what this looks like in the medium and long term, but simply reflect the fact that it's a first time, it's a first go around for everybody.
Yeah. Member Forsberg, do you have something to add on this question?
Yeah, a couple of thoughts. One on the ramp-up costs, and I don't doubt there are ramp-up costs, but I have never seen a permit, regulatory, environmental review effort that doesn't expand with time and become more costly. So to me, that kind of evens out. The other thought is on is it worthwhile to get these costs? You know, if you look at this from a high altitude, the government is imposing a time and dollar cost on doing this additional work. It provides its product at greenhouse gases. So to me, in the end, that's a political decision. Was the dollar spent by the public worth the product that you got? And that as this moves forward, the entire EQB board will be looking at this and making that decision. And I think that's appropriate. I think they need that information and that consideration.
Mm-hmm. All right, I want to move us on just because we're coming toward the end of our time here, just to flag a couple other things that came up in the discussion. One of the things that I thought was really interesting was something we came back to a few times around, like, there are 3 entities in this environmental review space: the proposers, the RGUs, and the public. And we, on the one hand, we want to think about what's usable and what kinds of information are desired by each of those entities, and make sure that we're thinking about all of them. Member Konar-Steenberg, you talked about that. On the other hand, it is the proposers and the RGUs, in my mind, that have to generate this information and review and evaluate this information. And they're the primary participants in the pilot program. So their experience of getting new information and how usable the tools are and how much effort that takes is, in my mind, on some level, one of the primary things that the pilot program is supposed to evaluate. So I just wanted to kind of bring that up to the surface again, in case folks had, and maybe Member Konar-Steenberg, you have more to say on this topic. Give you a chance.
No, I'll just very briefly reiterate what I said before. I would be very concerned about any process, as I said, that starts to give some of the constituencies any kind of special place at the table. That's just kind of what I'm on the lookout for here. And I conceive of the primary purpose of the pilot project is to work with the RGUs and benefit from their participation to get their best learning about how to make this the best process it can be. Once we go beyond that, I do start to get concerned about why we're making certain allowances for some participants and not for others. So that's just something that I'll keep an open mind and listen to it, but I start out with some skepticism on that question.
Okay, so let me make sure I understood that, because is it true, Director Wilson, is this pilot for the RGUs primarily, or is it for really, we want proposers and RGUs to be participants because they both, they touch the EAW form and use the new tools and all that? I guess I'm not totally clear on that.
Oh, Mr. Chair and Subcommittee Member Konar-Steenberg, I think you're both right, in the sense that, we went out and got public feedback on the elements of the form and gave everyone a chance to weigh in on the draft form. But when we got feedback from especially local units of government, but RGUs and project proposers, that they needed time and help to sort of recalibrate around these new expectations. There wasn't a lot of pushback in that feedback on the actual elements, but their ability to sort of rise to the occasion and produce that information. And so the idea of the pilot program came about as a way to help and support RGUs and project proposers through the process of learning and training, and to sort of bring their staff up to speed to be able to provide the information. But that said, I think members of the public are key participants in this process because they are consumers of that information. And so their feedback really helps us understand whether or not that training and that support is working, and whether or not the information that we envisioned when we created those questions is really resulting in, creates the result that we had hoped in revising the form. So as we've sort of gone through this process, I think we've learned a little bit ourselves. And so I think it would be easy enough to recalibrate these metrics and make sure for every one of them, there's sort of a need for information, both for the producer and consumer of the information.
Yeah, I guess I'm not questioning that the public is an important consumer of the information as well. It seems to me like for any project, the first person that tries to answer these questions and uses the guidance and uses the tools, that's a project proposer about their project. And the second person that looks at it is an RGU that's maybe using the same tools to see if they think the answer was adequate. Do they get the same kind of answers? Like those those are the producers, right? And they're, in my mind, they're equally kind of important if we're trying to assess how usable the EAW and the tools are. But I this is just my understanding. I'm not claiming that's the right answer or something. Member Connor Steenberg.
Yeah, and I guess, Mr. Chair, I guess what I would say is that's sort of, to me, that's 2/3 of the story. The rest of the story is, why are we doing environmental review at all? It's because the public is out there waiting for this information and needs this information.
Right.
And I don't think it makes sense to just limit it to just 2/3 of the story that way. And I'm not suggesting you were saying that, or that this process necessarily does that. But that's why I'm concerned about where we're drawing the lines here in terms of levels of involvement in the pilot. I think we got to be careful about that, because again, the whole purpose of it, as the rule states, is to, not the whole purpose, but one of the essential purposes is to make sure that this produces information for the consuming public.
Sure. Ms. Miltich, did you want to comment on this one as well?
Well, I do. I'm sort of losing sight of exactly what my comment, just thinking back to the earlier part of this conversation, like way at the beginning of this meeting, I would be concerned if there was a special role for, say, not to call anyone out in particular, but the Chamber of Commerce, to be intimately involved in the guts of the pilot program. I think of it as something that is for the folks that are putting together an environmental review document, not any, representatives of special interest areas. It's the participants in the pilot need to be practitioners, I guess, is what I would say. Not to shut the public out of it, but when I think of the like boots on the ground implementation of the pilot program, it's in the preparation of that environmental review document, in my mind, that most of this pilot stuff is happening. So I don't think it would be appropriate to include anyone in that space, in the preparation of environmental review document space, that isn't a practitioner that does that sort of thing. So just a thought.
Yeah, and this is Katie. I can just add, just a reminder about clarity of the structure that we're imagining, and why we're imagining it is that those kind of cohort meetings are practitioners, right? So they're responsible governmental units, both state and local, and consultants. And they're going to be actively working through EAWs. And so it is not appropriate in that setting, and this is what we've heard feedback on, to have members of the public or project proposers at the table for that practitioner process of doing the EAW process. But the needs and interests of project proposers and the unique role they play in providing information and the unique impact that this has on affecting their projects directly, that's really important for us to understand. It's also really important for us to understand the direct impact that this can have on the public and members of communities who are trying to understand the impacts that projects have on their communities, and the unique world that they consume the information, reading it, understanding it as sometimes a lay audience, and the unique intricacies of that. So we have these other audiences that we have to be really mindful about how we engage them and work with them, but it's distinct and different from the practitioners who are working through a legal process and are at the table together understanding those components. So that's how we're thinking of the design, and hopefully that makes sense to you all as subcommittee members.
Yeah, Chairman Martin.
Sorry, go ahead.
Al Forsberg here. I would agree with you, Nick, that the two primary participants are the project proposers who develop the information, pay for it, and hopefully use it to develop a better project, is one major participant. The other major participant, the RGU, that reviews that information and makes decisions. I would note that the public involvement comes largely through the RGUs, and that their involvement is very important. I think it's important that a project proposer be involved in this process somehow. And one suggestion was through the Chamber of Commerce, but I see what you're saying there. And if there's another way to get the project proposers clearly involved, listen to their ideas, make sure they're heard, they may have some really good ways to improve the process. I really think that those two primary participants should be key in how we move forward. Thank you.
Okay, we're almost at the end of our time, and I'm just trying to see if there's any other sort of recurring issues that ought to be flagged before we wrap up. Feel free, Katie or Denise, to help me if you'd like to, but I'm just kind of looking back over my notes.
Yeah, no, I think we're in a good place. I think we've summarized, again, the next steps here are, further refinement of these metrics. They're generally on the right track. Further refinement and fleshing out the methodology that will support these metrics. And then, the continued, kind of larger design pieces that we talked about last week, which is how do we bring those other groups along as part of the engagement process. So all that is kind of work between now and our ARIS meeting in January. And certainly, subcommittee members, will be reaching out to you for additional thoughts or advice as we work this material up. But I think I feel clear about our next steps and really appreciate this conversation and discussion. I think this will guide us as staff to make the adjustments that we need to get this ready.
Okay, great. That is good to hear. Any other, just as we're wrapping up, any other last comments from my fellow committee members? I don't know if Ms. Miltich, your hand is still up from before. Anything else?
Oh, just one of those virtual meeting things. I'll put my hand down.
All right, Member Forsberg.
I'm trying to get rid of my hand right now.
Okay. It's coming on and off, but
Control Shift R and doesn't go away.
all right.
There it went. For me, it went away anyway.
Yep.
Nicholas, another great job of chairing the meeting and giving us direction and helping us move forward and drawing out the information from everyone. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's nice to hear. Okay, I think with that we can adjourn unless there's any, well, actually, hang on. I'm supposed to say one other thing, one other reminder, which is January 19th. There will be an Environmental Review Implementation Subcommittee, ARIS meeting, and that is, help me here, Denise, that is the next time where, EQB staff will go back and take what they heard today and do some more work. They will, prior to that meeting, they will bring to us subcommittee members draft revisions, but that's the meeting when the sort of metrics and so on and design of the program, of the pilot program, will be presented, correct? And that'll be the next kind of public meeting on this. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. And also during that meeting, we do anticipate time on the agenda for public feedback on that final design.
Okay. Great. Well, with that, I think we're adjourned. Appreciate again everyone's time to participate in this meeting, and thanks to everyone from the public who joined to give us ideas or at least listen in. Thank you.
Thank you.